We don't need dirt-poor farmers with outdated equipment cluttering up our corporate land auction. The cruel words echoed through the auction hall as 72-year-old Harold Jenkins stood frozen in humiliation, his weathered hands still clutching the deed to his neighbor's farm. But 18 minutes later, when a line of military vehicles thundered into the parking lot, Victor Blackwell's smug expression crumbled as the decorated officer who emerged from the lead vehicle introduced himself. "I'm Colonel Samuel Jenkins, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Harold Jenkins's son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And before you sell another inch of land that sits on our county's primary watershed, we need to discuss some national security concerns." Clearview County's Agrimax auction center dominated the landscape just outside of Riverdale, its imposing glass and steel structure deliberately contrasting with the surrounding farmland. Once a humble livestock auction barn where local farmers had gathered for generations, it had been transformed over the past decade into a sleek corporate venue where family farms were efficiently transferred to agribusiness conglomerates. The main auction floor gleamed with polished concrete and recessed lighting, digital screens displaying property details and satellite imagery, replacing the hand-drawn maps of earlier days. A massive Agrimax logo covered the back wall, its stylized wheat sheaf transformed into a rising stock chart. Beneath it, a banner proclaimed, "Transforming agricultural assets into corporate opportunities." Victor Blackwell surveyed the gathering crowd with satisfaction. At 54, the regional director of Agrimax Auctions had perfected the art of the agricultural land sale. His tailored Italian suit and manicured appearance stood in deliberate contrast to the increasingly rare farmers who occasionally attended these events. 20 years ago, he'd been a struggling real estate agent in Riverdale. Now he commanded a 7-figure salary by efficiently transferring underperforming agricultural assets to corporate buyers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwell announced into his wireless microphone, moving to the elevated platform at the front of the room. "Today's premier auction features 12 exceptional properties totaling over 5,000 acres of prime development and agricultural land. We'll begin with the centerpiece, the historic Miller property. The digital screens shifted to display aerial views of a 400-acre farm that had been in the Miller family for 4 generations. The property featured rich bottomland soil, extensive frontage on the Clearwater River, and a strategic location just 2 miles from the planned interstate expansion. This exceptional opportunity combines agricultural potential with outstanding development prospects," Blackwell continued, his voice carrying the rehearsed enthusiasm of a man who had perfected his performance. "The minimum starting bid is $4.50 million. The crowd of approximately 40 people consisted primarily of representatives from investment firms, agricultural corporations, and development companies. They sat in ordered rows of ergonomic chairs, tablets, and smartphones, ready to communicate with distant corporate headquarters. In the back row, a handful of local farmers sat together, their presence more about bearing witness to the changing landscape than any realistic hope of purchasing the properties on offer. The auction house doors opened, and an elderly man in faded overalls and a worn John Deere cap entered quietly. Harold Jenkins moved slowly toward an empty seat in the back row, nodding silently to the other farmers as he passed. His gnarled hands clutched a leather portfolio containing county maps and water survey documents that looked out of place in the digital environment of the auction floor. Blackwell paused briefly as he noticed the newcomer, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before he continued his polished presentation. As you can see from the development overlay on your screens, the northern section offers exceptional commercial potential given the planned highway access point. As the corporate representatives began submitting their bids through the electronic system, Harold Jenkins studied the satellite imagery with growing concern. After several minutes, he raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chooses his words carefully. "There's an important consideration about that property that isn't mentioned in your materials." Blackwell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, unless you're a registered bidder, I must ask you to hold your comments until after the auction concludes. I'm not looking to disrupt," Harold continued calmly, "but that farm sits on a critical recharge zone for the county aquifer. There's a protected watershed covenant that restricts development on the eastern portion." A murmur ran through the crowd as several representatives glanced at their tablets, searching for this information in the property documents. "Sir," Blackwell responded, his voice hardening slightly, "I assure you that Agrimax performs comprehensive legal due diligence on all properties. Any relevant covenants would be disclosed in our materials." Harold opened his portfolio, removing several official-looking documents. The covenant was established in 1978 when the Army Corps of Engineers designated this area as critical infrastructure for the regional water supply. "I have the original documentation here." Blackwell's expression darkened as he stepped away from his podium. "Mr. Jenkins, Harold Jenkins, Mr. Jenkins, we appreciate your concern for local history, but this is a professional business event. Our legal team has thoroughly vetted all aspects of these properties." Blackwell's tone became patronizing as he addressed the elderly farmer directly. "The regulatory environment has changed significantly since whatever documents you might be referencing were created. The watershed protection doesn't expire," Harold explained, removing more papers from his portfolio. "It was established as part of the county's emergency water management system. I served on the Water Commission for 30 years, Mr. Jenkins," Blackwell interrupted sharply. "While your service to the community is admirable, Agrimax Auctions deals with contemporary legal realities, not historical committees and outdated restrictions." He gestured toward two security personnel who had appeared near the doors. "We don't need dirt-poor farmers with outdated equipment cluttering up our corporate land auction. If you're not here as a qualified bidder, I must ask you to leave." A pained expression crossed Harold's weathered face at the public humiliation, but he carefully returned the documents to his portfolio and stood with quiet dignity that seemed to fill more space than his physical frame. "The water knows where it needs to go, Mr. Blackwell," he said quietly, "and no amount of corporate paperwork will change that when the floods come. The only flood we're concerned with is the flood of investment capital," Blackwell replied with a manufactured chuckle intended for his corporate audience. "Please escort Mr. Jenkins out so we can continue with our qualified bidders." As the security personnel approached, Harold nodded politely to his fellow farmers and walked toward the exit, his back straight despite his 72 years. Before leaving, he paused at the door and looked back at the room. "That covenant exists because people once understood that some things matter more than profit," he said clearly. "The land remembers, even when people choose to forget." Outside in the parking lot, Harold Jenkins stood beside his faded blue 1997 Ford F-150 pickup truck, its once bright paint now dulled by 2 decades of sun and weather. The truck bed contained several wooden crates of fresh vegetables, his weekly delivery to the Riverdale Food Bank, a tradition he had maintained for over 30 years, regardless of his own financial circumstances. The Agrimax Auction Center cast a long shadow across the gravel lot, its reflective glass facade returning the sunlight in harsh glares. The building stood as a physical manifestation of Clearview County's transformation over the past 15 years, from a patchwork of family farms that had sustained generations to an increasingly corporate landscape where agriculture was merely another asset class to be optimized for shareholder value. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harold climbed slowly into his truck, but didn't immediately start the engine. Instead, he removed a worn flip phone from his pocket and paused, considering his options. He had promised his son Samuel that he wouldn't stir up trouble at his age, but the Miller farm was too important to the region's water supply to be developed without proper safeguards. The Miller property sat at the headwaters of 4 tributary streams that fed the county's reservoir system. The eastern portion contained a series of natural springs that maintained critical water flow during drought years, exactly why the Army Corps of Engineers had established the Watershed Covenant decades earlier. Harold had helped draft that covenant during his time on the Water Commission, working alongside environmental engineers to protect the region's most vital resource. As Harold deliberated, he opened his leather portfolio and removed a faded photograph, showing a much younger version of himself standing alongside James Miller, the recently deceased owner of the farm, now being auctioned. In the background, their children, including Harold's son Samuel, played near a pristine, spring-fed pond that served as the source for Clearwater Creek. The photograph captured not just a moment in time, but a shared understanding of stewardship that seemed increasingly foreign in the corporate auction hall he'd just left. Inside the auction center, Victor Blackwell had quickly re-established control after Harold's departure. "My apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen," he said with practiced smoothness. "As is sometimes the case, members of the farming community can become sentimental about land transfers. Rest assured that Agrimax Auctions conducts thorough title searches and legal due diligence on all properties." The electronic bidding resumed, with representatives from Heartland Agricultural Investments and Pioneer Development Group driving the price upward in increments of $250,000. The Miller farm was particularly attractive to corporate buyers because of its water resources. The very feature that made it environmentally sensitive was what made it valuable in an increasingly water-stressed agricultural landscape. "We're at $5.75 million from Heartland," Blackwell announced. "Do I see $6 million from Pioneer?" As the corporate representatives consulted with their headquarters via tablets and smartphones, Blackwell stood at his podium with the confident bearing of a man who had mastered his domain. In 15 years, he had personally overseen the transfer of over 200,000 acres of family farmland to corporate ownership throughout the tri-state area. Each auction represented not just a substantial commission, but a step in his carefully constructed career path toward Agrimax's executive leadership. The transformation of Riverdale and surrounding communities had been dramatic. Where diversified, family farms had once grown a variety of crops and raised livestock in sustainable rotations. Vast monoculture operations now stretched to the horizon. The town itself had changed too. Small equipment dealerships and local agricultural supply stores had been replaced by corporate chain outlets. The population had declined as farming opportunities disappeared, leaving empty storefronts on Main Street and declining enrollment in local schools. Those changes were invisible from the auction floor, where only the metrics of efficiency and profit appeared on the digital displays. The screens showed yield potential, development opportunities, and tax advantages, not the generations of knowledge about the land's particular characteristics that were being lost in the transition. In Chi, the parking lot, Harold finally made his decision. He dialed a number he rarely used, reserved for genuine emergencies. "Samuel, it's Dad." Harold's voice carried the weight of a man who disliked asking for help. "I'm sorry to bother you when you're working, but there's a situation at the Agrimax auction. They're selling the Miller farm without disclosing the Watershed Covenant." He listened for a moment to his son's response. No, I tried to tell them. They asked me to leave." He paused again. Yes, I'm fine. Just concerned about what happens when someone develops over those springs. As Harold continued the conversation, he didn't notice Victor Blackwell watching. From the auction house window, a satisfied smirk on his face. In Blackwell's assessment, he had successfully removed a potential complication to his carefully orchestrated land sale. The old farmer's concerns about watersheds and covenants were irrelevant in the face of corporate buyers eager to acquire prime agricultural assets. What Blackwell couldn't know was that Colonel Samuel Jenkins, Harold's son, currently served as the regional commander for the Army Corps of Engineers Water Infrastructure Protection Division. The covenant Harold had referenced wasn't merely some local agreement, it was part of a national security framework designating certain watershed areas as critical infrastructure. "I understand, Dad," Samuel said from his office 30 miles away at the regional military base. "Stay where you are. I'll handle this." As Harold ended the call, a sense of conflicted relief washed over him. He had raised his son to stand up for what was right, but he had never wanted to use Samuel's position to fight his battles. Yet the Miller Farm's water resources were too important to the entire region to remain silent. Inside the auction house, the bidding had reached $6.5 million, with Heartland Agricultural Investments and Pioneer Development Group still competing. For the property, the other corporate representatives had dropped out, recognizing that the two agricultural giants were determined to acquire the water rights that came with the land. $6.5 million from Heartland, Blackwell announced with barely concealed delight. His commission on this sale alone would fund the European vacation he'd been planning. "Do I see $675 million from Pioneer?" The Pioneer representative nodded, raising the electronic bidding paddle. $6.75 million. We have $6.75 million for the historic Miller property. This represents an excellent investment in both agricultural production and development potential. Do I hear $7 million? The auction was reaching its crescendo, exactly as Blackwell had choreographed. By positioning the Miller Farm as the first property of the day, he had established a competitive atmosphere that would carry through to the remaining 11 properties. By day's end, Agrimax would transfer over $50 million in agricultural land to corporate ownership, generating commissions that would cement Blackwell's position as the company's top producer. What he couldn't anticipate was that in approximately 12 minutes, his carefully orchestrated auction would come to an abrupt and public halt, and his understanding of power in Riverdale would be fundamentally altered. Harold Jenkins remained in his truck, watching as bidders occasionally stepped outside the auction center to take phone calls. Each wore the uniform of corporate agriculture, business casual attire with company-branded accessories, no trace of soil under their fingernails or sun weathering on their skin. These were people who knew land as coordinates on satellite maps and productivity metrics on spreadsheets, not as living systems that responded to careful stewardship. At 72, Harold embodied a vanishing way of life in Clearview County. His 60-acre vegetable farm on the outskirts of Riverdale was one of the few remaining family operations not absorbed by corporate interests. The land had been in the Jenkins family for 4 generations, passed down with an understanding that they were temporary caretakers rather than absolute owners. Harold's weathered face told the story of decades spent working outdoors. Deep, lines around alert blue eyes, skin tanned and toughened by sun and wind. His hands, resting now on the steering wheel, bore the permanent calluses and healed scars of a lifetime of physical labor. Though age had slowed his movements, his mind remained sharp, filled with the accumulated wisdom of 70 seasons of planting and harvest. Unlike many of his neighbors, Harold had managed to keep his farm by adapting rather than expanding. While others had taken on massive debt to acquire more land and equipment in a desperate race to achieve economies of scale, Harold had shifted to organic vegetables, established a thriving farmers market presence, and developed relationships with local restaurants interested in farm-to-table produce. His operation was modest but sustainable, generating enough income to maintain the land without compromising its health. What had preserved Harold's independence, however, was not just his agricultural adaptability, but also the military pension his late wife Margaret had left behind after 25 years of service as an army nurse. This financial foundation had allowed him to weather the economic storms that had forced so many other farmers to sell. Their son Samuel had followed his mother into military service, though through a different path. After earning civil engineering degrees on an ROTC scholarship, he had risen through the ranks of the Army Corps of Engineers. At 45, Colonel Jenkins now oversaw water infrastructure security for a 3-state region, a position that combined his engineering expertise with national security responsibilities. Inside the auction house, Victor Blackwell continued orchestrating the bidding with practiced precision. His tailored suit, designer eyeglasses, and meticulously maintained silver hair projected an image of sophisticated expertise that inspired confidence in corporate clients. At 54, he had mastered the art of the agricultural land transfer, transforming what had once been emotional, community-based transactions into streamlined corporate acquisitions. Born in Riverdale himself, Blackwell was the son of the local bank manager who had foreclosed on numerous farms during the agricultural crisis of the 1980s. He had witnessed firsthand how sentimentality about land resulted in financial ruin, an observation that had shaped his pragmatic approach to real estate. He had left Riverdale after high school, returning 15 years later with an MBA and a vision to capitalize on the continuing consolidation of agricultural land. $7.25 million from Heartland, Blackwell announced, his voice carrying rehearsed enthusiasm. Do I see $7.5 million from Pioneer? Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the Miller property includes mineral rights and substantial water resources, increasingly valuable assets in today's agricultural landscape. What Blackwell strategically omitted from his polished presentation was any mention of the watershed covenant Harold had referenced. The legal team at Agrimax had indeed discovered the document during their title search, but had determined it to be outdated and unenforceable, given changes to local zoning ordinances over the past 4 decades. Rather than disclose the covenant and explain their legal position, they had simply excluded it from the property information packet, a decision Blackwell had endorsed as streamlining the presentation of assets. This approach had served Agrimax well over the years. Most restrictive covenants on agricultural properties were relics of an earlier era, and few farmers had the resources to legally challenge their dismissal. Corporate buyers, eager to acquire land with development potential, rarely questioned omissions that worked in their favor. Blackwell glanced at his watch. Another hour would see the Miller property sold and the auction moving to the next parcel. His greatest skill lay in maintaining momentum, creating an atmosphere where deliberation gave way to competitive acquisition. The psychological dynamics of the auction room were his true expertise, understanding exactly when to push for higher bids and when to create a sense of urgency. Outside, Harold's phone rang. "Dad, I've mobilized a response team." Samuel's voice came through clearly. "We'll be there in about 10 minutes. The Miller farm is listed in our critical infrastructure database because of the aquifer recharge zone. We've been trying to contact Agrimax about this for weeks, but they've been dodging our calls." "I don't want to cause a scene, Sam," Harold replied, discomfort evident in his voice. "I just want them to disclose the covenant so buyers understand the development restrictions." This isn't just about disclosure, Dad. It's about national water security infrastructure. Those springs feed the reservoir that supplies water to the entire county, including the military base. We can't have that compromised by unrestricted development. Harold sighed, recognizing the shift from a local issue to a matter of regional security. His son had always been serious about his responsibilities, a trait he'd inherited from Margaret. When Samuel committed to addressing a problem, he did so thoroughly and by the book. Inside the auction house, the bidding had reached $8 million, with representatives from Heartland and Pioneer engaged in increasingly tense competition. Several other corporate bidders had rejoined the process, recognizing that the property's value continued to climb beyond initial projections. Blackwell's professional demeanor couldn't fully conceal his growing excitement. At a 3% commission, the sale would generate $240,000, potentially more if the bidding continued to escalate. His annual sales target would be nearly halfway met with this single transaction. $8.25 million from Pioneer, he announced. Do I hear $8.5 million from Heartland? The Heartland representative conferred briefly with someone via his earpiece before nodding. $8.5 million. We have $8.5 million for the Miller property. This represents an exceptional investment opportunity combining agricultural productivity with development potential in a prime location. As Blackwell continued his practice patter, a subtle vibration ran through the building, the distant rumble of heavy vehicles approaching on the gravel access road. Several bidders glanced toward the windows, momentarily distracted from the auction proceedings. Blackwell ignored the disturbance, determined to maintain the momentum he had carefully built. The property includes 400 acres of prime agricultural land, extensive water rights, and exceptional development potential given its proximity to the planned interstate expansion. Do I hear $875 million from Pioneer? The Pioneer representative raised his electronic paddle after a brief consultation with his headquarters. $8.75 million, we have $8.75 million. Do I hear $9 million from Heartland? The rumbling outside grew louder, clearly audible now even through the auction center's insulated walls. More bidders turned toward the windows, where the approaching convoy had become visible. 5 olive-drab military vehicles, led by 2 Humvees with official markings, dust billowing behind them as they approached the auction center at a deliberate pace. For the first time, Blackwell's polished facade showed cracks of genuine concern. Military intervention at a land auction was unprecedented in his experience. Quickly regrouping, he attempted to refocus the room's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, please, we have important business to conclude. I'm sure whatever official matter is taking place outside can proceed without our involvement. Now, do I hear $9 million for the Miller property? But the spell had been broken. The auction participants were now fully distracted, many standing to get a better view as the military vehicles pulled into the parking lot in precise formation. The military convoy came to a synchronized stop in the Agrimax parking lot, forming a semicircle facing the auction center's glass entrance. The lead vehicles bore the insignia of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, their official markings gleaming in the midday sun. Personnel in military uniforms emerged with disciplined efficiency, establishing a perimeter around the vehicles while several officers consulted electronic tablets. Inside the auction room, an uncomfortable silence had replaced the energetic bidding atmosphere. Corporate representatives exchanged concerned glances, several typing rapidly on their phones to alert their headquarters to this unexpected development. Blackwell stood at his podium, microphone still in hand, attempting to project calm authority while his mind raced through potential explanations and responses. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile, "let's continue with our proceedings. We have $8.75 million on the table for the Miller property. Do I hear $9 million from Heartland? The Heartland representative had risen from his seat, attention fully focused on the scene unfolding outside. Mr. Blackwell, I believe we should pause until we understand what's happening, he said, gesturing toward the military personnel now approaching the building. This is a private business event, Blackwell replied, an edge of irritation creeping into his voice. Whatever official business is taking place can surely wait until our auction concludes. The main doors to the auction center swung open and a military officer in full-dress uniform entered, flanked by two junior officers carrying document cases. The lead officer, whose insignia identified him as a full colonel, surveyed the room with practiced efficiency before proceeding directly. Toward the auction platform, Harold Jenkins entered behind them, moving quietly to stand near the back wall. Several local farmers nodded to him in silent acknowledgement, newfound respect evident in their expressions. Blackwell quickly assessed the situation, his sales instincts shifting to damage control. Whatever was happening, maintaining control of the room was paramount. He stepped down from his platform, extending his hand toward the approaching officer. Welcome to Agrimax Auctions, Colonel. I'm Victor Blackwell, Regional Director. We're in the middle of an important land sale, but perhaps my assistant can help you in another room until we conclude? Colonel Samuel Jenkins ignored the offer, and, instead producing an official identification card. Colonel Samuel Jenkins, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Water Infrastructure Protection Division. This auction needs to be temporarily suspended pending verification of compliance with federal watershed protection regulations. Blackwell's professional smile remained fixed, though tension radiated through his posture. Colonel, I assure you that Agrimax conducts thorough legal due diligence on all properties. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding that we can clarify after the conclusion of today's event. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Blackwell, Colonel Jenkins replied, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. The Miller property being auctioned contains designated critical water infrastructure protected under both federal regulations and a specific covenant established by this office in 1978. One of the junior officers opened his document case, producing a folder stamped with federal seals. We have the original documentation here, including maps delineating the protected zones that prohibit certain types of development and land use. Murmurs spread through the crowd as bidders began to realize the implications. Property with federal restrictions was significantly less valuable for development purposes, potentially altering the fundamental economics of their bidding calculations. Colonel, Blackwell said, lowering his voice and moving closer, I'm sure we can address any technical concerns after today's proceedings. These are sophisticated buyers who understand that all property comes with certain regulatory considerations. These aren't technical concerns, Mr. Blackwell, Colonel Jenkins responded, intentionally maintaining a volume that carried throughout the room. They are federal designations protecting critical water infrastructure for both civilian and military use. The failure to disclose these designations constitutes a material omission in your sale documentation. The representative from Pioneer Development stood up. Mr. Blackwell, is this accurate? Are there federal restrictions on this property that weren't included in the disclosure package? Blackwell's composure slipped momentarily as he faced the bidder. All relevant legal information was provided in accordance with standard industry practices. Any historical designations would have been evaluated by our legal team for current enforceability. The watershed covenant isn't historical, Mr. Blackwell, Colonel Jenkins interjected. It's an active federal designation that was reaffirmed. During our infrastructure security assessment just last year, we've made multiple attempts to contact Agrimax regarding this matter over the past 3 weeks. The room had gone completely silent now, all attention focused on the confrontation unfolding at the front of the auction floor. Harold Jenkins remained in the back, his expression neutral despite the vindication playing out before him. Blackwell attempted to regain control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this appears to be a procedural misunderstanding that we'll need to clarify. Perhaps we should take a brief recess while I consult with our legal team." "This isn't a procedural misunderstanding," Colonel Jenkins stated firmly. "The Miller property contains the headwaters of 4 tributary streams that feed the county reservoir system, which supplies both civilian populations and critical military infrastructure. Development restrictions on the eastern portion of the property are non-negotiable matters of national security infrastructure." The second junior officer stepped forward, distributing documents to the corporate representatives. "These maps clearly delineate the protected areas and associated restrictions. Under federal law, these should have been included in any sale." "Documentation." Blackwell's face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger. "Colonel, while I appreciate your concerns, this intervention in a private business transaction is unprecedented and potentially illegal. Agrimax Auctions operates in full compliance with all applicable regulations." "Then you won't mind if we verify that compliance," Colonel Jenkins replied evenly. "As the Regional Commander for Water Infrastructure Protection, I have the authority to temporarily suspend any land transfer involving designated critical water infrastructure pending verification of regulatory compliance." He turned to address the assembled bidders directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of transparency and to prevent any of you from making investment decisions based on incomplete information, I am requesting a temporary halt to these proceedings pending a full review of the property's federal designations." The corporate representatives had begun rapidly communicating with their headquarters, many already withdrawing from the bidding process as the new information fundamentally altered their valuation models. The Miller property, without full development rights, was worth significantly less than the current $8.75 million bid. Blackwell made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Colonel, surely we can resolve this without such a dramatic interruption. Perhaps a brief consultation with your office would suffice." "An elderly gentleman already attempted to provide this information through appropriate channels earlier today," Colonel Jenkins responded. "I understand he was escorted from the premises rather than having his concerns addressed." All eyes turned to Harold Jenkins, who stood quietly at the back of the room. There was a moment of collective realization as the bidders connected the elderly farmer with the military officer now halting the auction. "Your father?" Blackwell stammered, the color draining from his face as he finally made the connection. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell," Colonel Jenkins confirmed, his voice level but carrying unmistakable intensity. "Harold Jenkins, the dirt-poor farmer you had removed from your auction, is my father. He served on the County Water Commission for 3 decades and helped establish the very watershed protection covenant you failed to disclose." A wave of uncomfortable recognition swept through the room as the power dynamics visibly shifted. Blackwell, who had dismissed Harold with such contempt just 40 minutes earlier, now stood confronted, not just by military authority, but by the consequences of his own arrogance. "Had I known," Blackwell began. "Had you known he was my father?" Colonel Jenkins interrupted sharply. "Would you have treated him with the respect every citizen deserves? Would you have dismissed his concerns because of his age or his occupation? Or would you have listened only because of his connection to me?" Blackwell had no answer. "Your auction is suspended pending review," Colonel Jenkins continued, his military bearing unwavering despite the personal nature of the confrontation. "My team will be examining the documentation for all properties scheduled for today's auction to ensure proper disclosure of federal designations and restrictions." He turned, To address the assembled bidders, I apologize for any inconvenience this causes to those of you who traveled here in good faith. The Army Corps of Engineers will ensure that when these properties are eventually cleared for sale, all regulatory designations will be clearly documented. The corporate representatives began gathering their materials, many casting accusatory glances at Blackwell. The auction room, which had hummed with competitive energy just minutes earlier, now buzzed with whispered conversations and hurried phone calls as bidders reported the situation to their headquarters. Blackwell made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Colonel, surely we can resolve this without such drastic measures. Perhaps a brief recess to review the documentation your father has provided?" "Mr. Blackwell," Colonel Jenkins said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority, "this isn't merely about documentation. It's about the systematic dismissal of critical infrastructure protections that have characterized too many land transactions in this county. My office has received numerous complaints about Agrimax's failure to disclose federal designations, but until today, we lacked the clear evidence needed for intervention." He gestured to the junior officers, who had begun setting up a temporary workspace at the side of the auction room. "These officers will review all property documentation while our environmental assessment team conducts their initial survey. You're welcome to contact Agrimax's legal department, but I suggest they cooperate fully." As the room quickly emptied of bidders, Harold approached his son, discomfort evident in his bearing. "Sam, I didn't call you to shut down the auction. I just wanted someone to verify the covenant's existence." Colonel Jenkins briefly dropped his official demeanor, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "I know, Dad, but when you told me they'd thrown you out for trying to share vital information about the property, it confirmed the pattern we've been investigating for months." He lowered his voice. "We've had reports from 2 counties about Agrimax's failure to disclose federal water protection zones on properties they've auctioned. They've built quite a business selling off our community piece by piece," Harold observed, glancing toward Blackwell, who was now engaged in an intense phone conversation with what appeared to be Agrimax's legal department. "That business model is about to face significant regulatory scrutiny," his son replied. "The Federal Infrastructure Protection Office has been looking for a case like this to establish stronger disclosure requirements for sales involving protected watersheds." Across the room, Blackwell ended his call and looked up, catching Harold's eye. The auctioneer's expression had transformed from smugness to something approaching fear as he watched the military personnel systematically reviewing his auction documents. In the span of 40 minutes, his carefully constructed world of exclusive deals and selective disclosures had begun to crumble. Harold felt no triumph, only quiet satisfaction that the land might now be treated with the respect it deserved. He opened his weathered portfolio, showing his son the original watershed maps he had helped develop decades earlier. "The water knows where it needs to go," he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken when being escorted out. "Even when people try to forget," Colonel Jenkins nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his father's words. "And sometimes," he added, "it just needs someone willing to speak for it." Blackwell approached them, his confident stride replaced by a more hesitant gait. His tailored suit and manicured appearance, so impressive in the context of the auction, now seemed merely superficial against the authentic authority of the father and son. "Colonel Jenkins," he began, his voice carefully modulated, "I want to assure you that any omissions in our documentation were unintentional. Agrimax has always prided itself on transparency and compliance." "Save it for the official review, Mr. Blackwell," Colonel Jenkins replied. "My team will conduct a thorough assessment of your disclosure practices across all properties currently listed with Agrimax in counties containing designated water infrastructure." He handed Blackwell an official document. "This is formal notice of our investigation. I suggest you contact your corporate headquarters immediately and advise them to preserve all records relating to properties containing wetlands, aquifer recharge zones, or watershed protection areas. Blackwell accepted the document, his hand trembling slightly. Of course, Colonel, we'll cooperate fully. He hesitated, then turned to Harold. Mr. Jenkins, I want to apologize for my earlier behavior. Had I understood your expertise regarding the watershed covenant— It shouldn't have mattered, Harold interrupted quietly. You didn't dismiss me because I lacked expertise. You dismissed me because you thought I lacked power. The simple truth of the statement hung in the air between them. Blackwell had no response that wouldn't confirm the accuracy of Harold's assessment. Outside the auction center, the remaining farmers had gathered near Harold's truck, watching with a combination of surprise and satisfaction as the military team continued to arrive, additional vehicles now bringing environmental assessment specialists and legal personnel. "Never thought I'd see the day," commented Edward Grantham, whose family had lost 300 acres to foreclosure the previous year. "Agrimax has been running roughshod over this county for a decade." "It's not just about stopping one auction," Harold replied. "It's about recognizing that some things matter more than profit, like making sure our grandchildren have clean water." Inside, the junior officers had discovered discrepancies in multiple properties scheduled for auction. "Colonel," one reported, "we've identified federal water protection designations on 3 additional parcels that aren't disclosed in the sale documentation." Colonel Jenkins nodded grimly. "Document everything. I want a comprehensive report on all omissions and misrepresentations." He turned back to Blackwell, who had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm expanding our investigation to include all Agrimax auctions conducted in this region over the past 3 years." Blackwell's professional facade had completely collapsed now, replaced by the genuine fear of a man watching his career implode. "That's hundreds of properties, Colonel. Surely such an extensive review isn't necessary based on a few oversights." "These aren't oversights, Mr. Blackwell," Colonel Jenkins replied. "They represent a pattern of disregard for federal infrastructure, protections that potentially threatens regional water security. Given your company's market dominance in agricultural land transfers, the implications are significant enough to warrant comprehensive review." As word of the auction's suspension spread, local media began arriving, cameras and microphones at the ready. The story: an elderly farmer vindicated by his military son shutting down a corporate land auction, had the perfect elements for compelling coverage. Reporters attempted to approach Harold, but he waved them away, uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't do this for recognition," he told his son as they watched the scene unfold. "I just couldn't stand by while they sold the Miller place without telling people about the watershed." "I know, Dad," Colonel Jenkins replied, "but sometimes standing up for what's right has bigger consequences than we anticipate." Blackwell, observing their conversation from a distance, finally began to understand the true miscalculation he had made. He had dismissed Harold Jenkins not just because he was an elderly farmer in worn overalls, but because he had assumed that such a man would have no recourse, no connections, no power to challenge Agrimax's dominance. In doing so, he had revealed the fundamental flaw in his approach to the community, seeing the residents of Clearview County not as citizens with legitimate concerns and deep knowledge of the land, but as obstacles to be removed in service of corporate efficiency. As the afternoon progressed, the initial shock gave way to methodical investigation. Colonel Jenkins established a temporary command center in what had been the auction registration area, coordinating with federal and state environmental protection agencies. Harold provided detailed knowledge of the watershed systems, drawing on decades of observation that no satellite mapping or recent survey could replace. Together, they represented something Blackwell had failed to anticipate: the convergence of formal authority and generational wisdom. each strengthening the other in service of something larger than individual interest. The sunset cast long shadows across the Agrimax parking lot as the day's dramatic events settled into organized activity. Military personnel continued their methodical review of property documents, setting up impromptu workstations in what had been the auction house's reception area. The corporate bidders had long since departed, leaving only local farmers who lingered to witness this unexpected reckoning. Harold Jenkins sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching as his son coordinated the federal response with practiced efficiency. There was pride in his observation, but also a quiet discomfort with being at the center of such disruption. Throughout his life, Harold had preferred working quietly with the land to engaging in public confrontations. "Quite a day, Harold," said Martha Simmons, approaching his truck. At 68, she was one of the few remaining independent farmers whose property bordered the Miller farm. "Never thought I'd see Agrimax get called to account like this." Harold nodded, his weathered face revealing little of his thoughts. "Wasn't my intention to cause such a scene, just wanted them to acknowledge the covenant." "Sometimes a small stone starts a landslide," Martha replied, settling beside him on the tailgate. "Those watersheds feed all our properties. What happens upstream affects everyone downstream. That's something corporate folks never seem to understand." Inside the auction center, Victor Blackwell sat alone at what had been his commanding podium, now just an ordinary desk dwarfed by the military operations surrounding him. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from Agrimax headquarters, each demanding updates and explanations he couldn't provide. The company's general counsel was already en route from Chicago, and the CEO had scheduled an emergency board meeting for the following morning. Blackwell's carefully constructed professional world was unraveling with each document the military team reviewed. The pattern of omissions regarding federal water protections wasn't limited to the Miller property. Similar designations had been downplayed or excluded from at least 7 other properties scheduled for today's auction. What had begun as embarrassment was evolving into something more serious. Federal regulations regarding critical infrastructure carried potential penalties far beyond the civil liability Agrimax typically factored into its risk assessments. For the first time in his career, Blackwell faced the prospect of personal liability for decisions he had approved. As darkness fell over Clearview County, the impromptu investigation showed no signs of concluding. Portable lights illuminated the auction center parking lot, where additional military vehicles continued to arrive. The local sheriff had established a perimeter, keeping curious onlookers and media at a respectful distance. Colonel Jenkins approached, his father's truck, removing his uniform cap as he stepped out of his official role and into his familial one. "It's going to be a long night, Dad. You should head home and get some rest." Harold studied his son's face, seeing both the boy he had raised and the officer he had become. "Found more problems with their paperwork, I take it?" Samuel nodded grimly. "The Miller farm was just the tip of the iceberg. They've been systematically minimizing or excluding federal designations from properties throughout the watershed. Some of these sales have already gone through. We'll need to contact the new owners about compliance issues." "Those springs on the Miller place feed half the county during drought years," Harold observed. "James Miller understood that. It's why he agreed to the covenant in the first place. He knew the water belonged to everyone, not just whoever owned the deed to that particular piece of land. That's the perspective we've been missing in these land transfers," Samuel agreed. "The corporate model treats each property as an isolated asset rather than part of an interconnected system." Across the parking lot, Blackwell emerged from the auction center, his usual confident stride replaced by the hesitant gait of a man whose certainties had been shattered. He paused, observing the Jenkins men in conversation, then approached with visible reluctance. "Colonel Jenkins," he began, then corrected himself. Mr. Jenkins, both Mr. Jenkins, I've been authorized by Agrimax to offer a complete suspension of all pending auctions until we can conduct a full review of our disclosure practices. Harold regarded the auctioneer silently, noting how the man's polished appearance had deteriorated over the course of the day. The perfectly pressed suit was now rumpled, the carefully styled hair disheveled from hours of stressed fingers running. "Who threw it?" "That's a start," Colonel Jenkins replied, "but my team will still need to complete its assessment of all properties currently in your inventory. The water infrastructure protection regulations aren't optional, Mr. Blackwell. They exist to safeguard essential resources for both civilian and military needs." Blackwell nodded, the fight gone from his bearing. "Our legal team will be here first thing tomorrow morning to cooperate with your investigation." He hesitated, then turned directly to Harold. "Mr. Jenkins, I want to apologize again for how I treated you earlier today. It was unprofessional and unkind." Harold acknowledged the apology with a slight nod, but offered no absolution. The harm Blackwell had inflicted wasn't personal. It was part of a larger pattern of dismissing local knowledge and community concerns in favor of corporate efficiency. One apology couldn't address the systematic devaluation of generational wisdom about the land. As Blackwell returned to the auction center, Samuel settled beside his father on the truck's tailgate. "You should have called me sooner, Dad. We've been trying to get Agrimax to address these issues for months, but they've managed to dodge our inquiries through various legal maneuvers." Harold sighed. "Never wanted to use your position to fight my battles, Sam. Your mother and I raised you to stand on your own merits, not to pull rank for family advantage." "This isn't about family advantage," Samuel countered. "It's about protecting critical infrastructure. The Miller Farm watershed feeds the reservoir that supplies water to the entire county, including the military base. If that gets compromised by unrestricted development, it's a legitimate security concern." Harold nodded, accepting his son's framing of the situation. Still, he couldn't help feeling that today's events had somehow crossed a line he had spent his life respecting. The boundary between personal concerns and professional authority. "Go home, Dad," Samuel said gently. "We've got this handled. I'll stop by tomorrow morning and update you on what we find." Harold reluctantly agreed, starting his truck's engine. As he pulled away from the auction center, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the scene that had unfolded from his simple attempt to have a covenant acknowledged. Military vehicles, official personnel, and the local community gathered to witness a corporate giant being held accountable. The drive back to his farm took Harold past the Miller property, its rolling fields and wooded eastern section now bathed in moonlight. He slowed as he passed the natural springs that had been the focus of the watershed covenant, their burbling waters audible even from the road. James Miller had been his friend for over 50 years before passing away 6 months earlier. They had established the covenant together, understanding that water transcended property lines and generational boundaries. "We did what we could, James," Harold murmured to his departed friend. "Let's hope it's enough." At home, Harold settled into his evening routine with the comfortable familiarity of decades. His modest farmhouse, built by his grandfather in 1934, stood in stark contrast to the sleek corporate efficiency of the Agrimax auction center. Here, every worn floorboard and weathered doorframe told a story of family history and agricultural cycles. As he prepared a simple dinner, Harold's thoughts returned to Blackwell's dismissive words at the auction. "Dirt-poor farmers with outdated equipment." The characterization stung, not because of its personal insult, but because of its fundamental misunderstanding of what farming represented in Clearview County. The farms weren't merely economic units to be optimized for maximum profit. They were living systems tended by families who measured success across generations rather than quarterly reports. The outdated equipment Blackwell had mockingly referenced included Harold's 1976 John Deere tractor, still running perfectly after nearly 5 decades, thanks to meticulous maintenance and mechanical knowledge passed from father to son. Later, sitting on his porch with a cup of tea, Harold watched as distant lights moved across the Miller property, the environmental assessment team his son had deployed to document the watershed features. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and official proceedings, corporate damage control and regulatory consequences. But tonight, the land simply continued its eternal rhythms, indifferent to human disputes over ownership and development rights. The water would flow where gravity pulled it, the springs would rise where underground pressure directed them, and the watershed would continue its complex dance of filtration and renewal. If only human intervention didn't disrupt the systems nature had perfected over millennia. Harold Jenkins had never considered himself an environmental activist or a corporate antagonist. He was simply a farmer who understood that stewardship required honoring the land's inherent wisdom rather than imposing human convenience upon it. That understanding, dismissed as outdated by men like Blackwell, might now find vindication through his son's intervention. With that thought providing some measure of resolution, Harold prepared for bed, setting his alarm for the pre-dawn hours, when his vegetables would need harvesting for tomorrow's farmer's market, a rhythm unchanged by today's dramatic events. Whatever corporate drama unfolded at the auction center, the essential work of tending the land continued with the reliability of the seasons themselves. Dawn broke over Clearview County with the soft, golden light of early autumn, illuminating dew-covered fields and the winding tributaries of the watershed system. Harold Jenkins had been awake since 4:30 a.m., harvesting vegetables with practiced efficiency despite his age. Years of early mornings had conditioned his body to function before most people's alarms had sounded. By 7 a.m., his truck was loaded, with crates of fresh produce for the weekly farmer's market, heirloom tomatoes, sweet corn, zucchini, and peppers arranged in neat rows. The disruption at yesterday's auction hadn't altered these fundamental rhythms of agricultural life. While corporate land transfers might be temporarily suspended, the growing cycle continued its inexorable progression. Harold was washing up after his morning's work when a convoy of vehicles turned into his gravel driveway. He recognized his son's official car leading several civilian vehicles, expensive sedans and SUVs bearing rental company plates. As he stepped onto his porch, Samuel emerged from the lead car in his dress uniform, accompanied by 2 junior officers. From the following vehicles came men and women in business attire, carrying briefcases and tablets, clearly attorneys and corporate representatives. "Morning, Dad," Samuel called, approaching the porch. "Hope you don't mind the company. After last night's findings, Agrimax requested an urgent meeting, and I thought your place would be more appropriate than a government office." Harold raised an eyebrow at his son. "My kitchen table isn't exactly designed for corporate negotiations." Samuel smiled slightly. "Exactly why I chose it. Some conversations need to happen on neutral ground that reminds everyone what's actually at stake." The small procession made its way to the porch, with Victor Blackwell among the last to emerge from the vehicles. The auctioneer's usual confident bearing was entirely absent, replaced by the cautious demeanor of a man navigating unfamiliar territory. His designer suit looked out of place against the backdrop of the working farm. A distinguished older woman approached, extending her hand to Harold. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm Catherine Hargrove, Chief Legal Officer for Agrimax. Thank you for allowing us to meet at your home on such short notice." Harold nodded, accepting the handshake with calloused fingers. "Coffee's fresh if anyone wants some. Nothing fancy, just regular farm coffee." Inside Harold's modest kitchen, An improvised meeting took shape around the oak table that had served 4 generations of the Jenkins family. Corporate executives and military personnel sat on mismatched chairs beneath family photographs and shelves, lined with canning jars of preserved vegetables. Colonel Jenkins opened the discussion formally. Based on our preliminary investigation, we've identified systematic omissions of federal water protection designations from Agrimax auction materials. These omissions appear consistent across multiple properties and potentially affect land transfers. Dating back at least 3 years, Catherine Hargrove nodded grimly. We've conducted an emergency internal review overnight and must acknowledge serious deficiencies in our disclosure protocols. Agrimax takes full responsibility for these oversights and is prepared to implement comprehensive remedies. She placed a document on the table. We're proposing an immediate suspension of all pending auctions in watersheds containing federal designations, followed by a complete review of all transactions completed in the past 5 years. Harold observed the proceedings quietly, noting how different this meeting was from yesterday's auction. Here, in his simple farmhouse kitchen, corporate power seemed diminished, stripped of its impressive venues and digital displays. The executives fidgeted on wooden chairs that bore the marks of decades of family meals, surrounded by the authentic artifacts of agricultural life rather than the curated prosperity of corporate environments. Victor Blackwell remained largely silent, his gaze fixed on the tabletop as his professional world underwent fundamental restructuring. Occasionally, his eyes drifted to the kitchen window, which framed a view of Harold's fields, rows of vegetables tended with the careful precision that came from decades of agricultural knowledge. Beyond remedying past oversights, Hargrove continued, Agrimax is prepared to implement new protocols for all agricultural auctions. These would include independent environmental assessment and specific disclosure of all regulatory designations, easements, and covenants. Colonel Jenkins reviewed the proposed measures with professional detachment. These protocols align with our recommendations, but implementation and verification will be critical. The Army Corps of Engineers will require oversight of the review process for all properties containing designated water infrastructure. As the meeting continued, technical details and legal frameworks dominated the discussion. Harold listened without comment, understanding that these corporate representatives and military officials spoke a different language than the one he shared with the land. Their reality constructed of regulations and compliance rather than rainfall patterns and soil composition. Midway through the discussion, an Agrimax executive raised a point about economic impacts. While we're committed to regulatory compliance, we need to consider the market implications of these additional disclosures. Buyers may dramatically reduce their valuations if development potential is perceived as restricted. Harold broke his silence. That's exactly the point. All eyes turned to him, surprised by his interjection. Land isn't just a commodity to be valued based on what you can build on it, he continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime in intimate relationship with the subject under discussion. Its true value includes the services it provides to the entire community: water filtration, flood control, habitat. The Miller Farms springs aren't just features on a property map. They're the reason half this county has drinking water during drought years. He gestured toward the window, where his own fields stretched toward the horizon. James Miller understood that when he agreed to the covenant, he knew he was protecting something that belonged to everyone, not just whoever held the deed. The executive appeared taken aback by this perspective, unprepared to engage with values that couldn't be quantified in financial terms. Catherine Hargrove studied Harold thoughtfully. Mr. Jenkins, I understand you served on the Water Commission. For many years, would you be willing to consult with Agrimax as we develop these new protocols? Your knowledge of the local watershed systems would be invaluable. Before Harold could respond, Blackwell unexpectedly spoke up. Mr. Jenkins' involvement would be beneficial. The auctioneer seemed to struggle with this acknowledgement, his professional identity visibly shifting as he continued. Local knowledge is a resource we've consistently undervalued in our assessment processes. Harold regarded Blackwell with surprise at this admission. My concern isn't with helping Agrimax improve its business model, Ms. Hargrove. It's with protecting the land and water that sustains this community, which is precisely why we need your perspective, she replied. Agrimax has clearly failed to incorporate crucial local knowledge into our processes. That failure has not only created legal liability, but has fundamentally compromised our ability to represent these properties accurately. The meeting continued for another hour, with specific agreements taking shape around review processes and disclosure requirements. Throughout, Harold's kitchen remained the unlikely setting for this corporate recalibration. Jars of home-canned tomatoes and family photographs providing silent testimony to values that transcended quarterly profits and market efficiencies. The meeting concluded, and the participants began to disperse. Blackwell lingered behind, clearly uncomfortable, but determined. He approached Harold, who was rinsing coffee cups at the sink. "Mr. Jenkins," he began hesitantly, "I want to apologize again for yesterday, not just for the disrespect, but for not listening." Harold turned, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Listening is harder than it looks, Mr. Blackwell, especially when someone's saying things that don't fit your business model." Blackwell nodded, accepting the implicit rebuke. "I've spent 15 years seeing land as inventory to be moved efficiently. From seller to buyer, yesterday made me realize how much I've been missing." Through the kitchen window, they could see Colonel Jenkins conferring with his officers near their vehicles. The military presence on the farm created a striking juxtaposition. Formal authority aligned with the informal wisdom Harold represented. "Your son is quite impressive," Blackwell observed. "You must be proud." "Sam follows his own path," Harold replied, "just like his mother did. They both understood that serving something larger than yourself gives life its meaning." Blackwell considered this, the concept clearly foreign to his professional framework. Agrimax will be undergoing significant changes in how we approach agricultural land transfers. Ms. Hargrove was serious about wanting your input. Harold regarded the auctioneer thoughtfully. 24 hours ago, you had me escorted out of your auction for trying to share information about a watershed covenant. Now you're standing in my kitchen asking for my expertise. That's quite a reversal, Mr. Blackwell." "Yes," Blackwell acknowledged, discomfort evident in his bearing. "It is." As the corporate and military contingent departed, Harold and his son remained on the porch, watching the procession of vehicles navigate the gravel driveway. "Did you ever imagine your phone call would lead to all this?" Samuel asked. Harold shook his head. "Just wanted them to acknowledge the covenant. Didn't expect to bring the corporate lawyers out to sit at my kitchen table." Samuel smiled slightly. "Sometimes the smallest actions have the largest consequences, Dad, especially when they're motivated by the right principles." The following week brought unprecedented changes to Clearview County's agricultural landscape. The local newspaper, the Riverdale Gazette, ran a front-page headline that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. "Agrimax suspends all land auctions pending federal review." The article detailed the discovery of systematic omissions regarding federal watershed protections and quoted both military officials and corporate representatives acknowledging the need for reform. For the farming community, the story held particular significance. Many had watched helplessly for years as Agrimax auctions transferred family farms to corporate ownership with little regard for local concerns or generational knowledge. The sudden halt represented not just a regulatory intervention, but a fundamental shift in power dynamics that had seemed immutable. Harold Jenkins found himself in an unexpected position as the catalyst for this transformation. Neighbors stopped by his farm throughout the week, some offering congratulations, others seeking information about how the changes might affect pending land sales. He accepted neither credit nor attention, maintaining the same modest routine that had characterized his 7 decades of farming. On Wednesday morning, a town hall meeting was convened at the Riverdale Community Center to address community concerns about the suspended auctions and ongoing investigation. The simple meeting room, usually host to local government committees and community groups, was filled beyond capacity. Farmers in work clothes sat alongside corporate representatives and local officials, all drawn by the unprecedented situation. Colonel Samuel Jenkins presented the preliminary findings of the Army Corps of Engineers investigation, his military precision bringing clarity to complex regulatory issues. Large maps displayed on easels showed the extensive watershed system that connected seemingly separate properties throughout the county. The physical manifestation of interdependence that had been systematically ignored in corporate land transactions. The Miller Farm Watershed Covenant isn't an isolated restriction, he explained, highlighting key areas on the map. It's part of an integrated water management system essential for both civilian and military infrastructure. Similar protections exist on at least 27 properties throughout Clearview County, many of which have changed hands in recent years without proper disclosure. Catherine Hargrove, representing Agrimax, acknowledged the failures identified. In the investigation, our company failed to appropriately value and disclose these crucial designations, she stated. We're implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure all environmental and infrastructure protections are clearly communicated in future transactions. The most striking moment came when Victor Blackwell approached the podium. The auctioneer's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by a more thoughtful presence. As he addressed the community, he had served primarily as a facilitator of corporate acquisition. For 15 years, I've conducted land auctions in this county with a focus on maximizing sale prices and transfer efficiency, he began. What I failed to recognize was the value of local knowledge, the generational understanding of how these properties function as interconnected systems rather than isolated assets. He glanced toward Harold, seated quietly in the back row. It took being confronted by someone whose wisdom I initially dismissed to help me see that our entire approach to agricultural land transfer needs reconsideration. 3 months after the confrontation at the auction house, the first tangible signs of systemic change began to emerge in Clearview County. Agrimax had undergone a corporate restructuring, with Victor Blackwell reassigned from his position as regional director to head a newly created Agricultural Heritage and Environmental Compliance division. The promotion surprised many who had expected him to face demotion or dismissal following the federal investigation. The Miller Farm, which had been the catalyst for these changes, remained in legal limbo as the Watershed Covenant was formally reassessed and strengthened under federal oversight. Rather than being sold to the highest bidder, the property became the test case for a new approach to agricultural land transfer. One that valued water resources and ecological services alongside traditional metrics of productivity and development potential. Harold Jenkins found himself reluctantly serving on a newly formed Agricultural Land Stewardship Committee, which brought together farmers, regulatory officials, and corporate representatives to develop guidelines for land transactions that acknowledge both economic realities and environmental responsibilities. His kitchen table, which had hosted That pivotal meeting became a symbolic reference point for bringing disparate interests together on equal footing. What we're attempting, Harold explained at one committee meeting, is to make visible what's always been true but frequently ignored, that land has value beyond its sale price, and that some of this value belongs to the community rather than any individual owner. The most significant change came in December, when Agrimax unveiled its reformed auction protocols at a community presentation in the Riverdale High School gymnasium. Victor Blackwell, standing before many of the same people who had witnessed his confrontation with Harold months earlier, introduced a fundamentally different approach to agricultural land transfers. Each property that comes to auction will now include a comprehensive environmental assessment, he explained, displaying sample documentation on the projection screen. Water resources, soil characteristics, wildlife habitat, and all regulatory designations will be clearly identified and explained. Most strikingly, the new protocols included a formal role for local knowledge, a property heritage assessment that documented generational observations about seasonal patterns, historical, land use, and ecological relationships not captured in conventional surveys or title searches. We've come to recognize that farmers who have worked with these lands for decades possess invaluable knowledge that deserves acknowledgement and compensation, Blackwell continued. This knowledge will now be formally incorporated into property documentation rather than dismissed as anecdotal or sentimental. For Harold, watching from the audience, the presentation represented not a personal vindication but a community one. Recognition that the wisdom accumulated through generations of agricultural stewardship had legitimate value in land management decisions. After the presentation, Blackwell approached Harold in the school parking lot, their breath visible in the December cold. The relationship between the two men had evolved from antagonism to a cautious professional respect, though neither would have characterized it as friendship. Your insights have been essential to this process, Mr. Jenkins, Blackwell acknowledged. I won't pretend that Agrimax has transformed overnight into a philanthropic enterprise, but we're genuinely attempting to balance profit motives with responsible stewardship. Harold nodded, accepting the statement without effusive response. Land endures beyond quarterly reports, Mr. Blackwell. The decisions we make about it shape communities for generations. As they stood in the cold evening air, the contrast between their initial confrontation and current collaboration highlighted how dramatically the landscape had shifted, not just in regulatory terms, but in the fundamental recognition of what constituted value in agricultural land transactions. The water, as Harold had observed months earlier, knew where it needed to go, and sometimes it just needed someone willing to speak for it. 5 years later, the ripples from that confrontation at the Agrimax auction house had spread far beyond Clearview County. What had begun as a dispute over a watershed covenant had evolved into a regional model for agricultural land stewardship that balanced economic interests with environmental protection. The annual Sustainable Agricultural Land Conference, hosted at the Riverdale Community College, drew participants from 3 states: farmers, corporate representatives, environmental advocates, and government officials gathered to discuss the implementation of what had come to be known as the Jenkins Protocol for agricultural land transfers. Harold Jenkins, now 77, sat in the front row of the college auditorium, uncomfortable with the attention but present at his son's insistence. His weathered hands, still bearing the calluses of daily farm work, rested on the same leather portfolio that had held the watershed documents 5 years earlier. On stage, Victor Blackwell presented data from the first comprehensive assessment of the reformed auction system. His corporate polish remained, but it now served a different purpose, communicating complex land stewardship principles to diverse audiences rather than maximizing property values for corporate clients. Over the past 5 years, Blackwell explained, gesturing toward charts displayed on the screen behind him, we've facilitated the transfer of more than 15,000 acres of agricultural land using the integrated assessment protocols. What we've discovered challenges conventional wisdom about agricultural economics. The data showed something remarkable. Properties with comprehensive environmental assessments and formally documented local knowledge commanded premium prices in the marketplace, rather than the discounted valuations many had predicted. Buyers were willing to pay more, not less, for land when they understood its ecological functions and management history. The value proposition has fundamentally shifted, Blackwell continued. Buyers now recognize that understanding water systems, soil health, and generational management practices represents a tangible asset rather than a regulatory burden. Colonel Samuel Jenkins, now a brigadier general with broader responsibility for infrastructure security, presented complementary findings from the military perspective. The watershed protection system that had triggered the initial confrontation had been strengthened and expanded, creating what he described as agricultural security zones that safeguarded water resources while maintaining productive farming operations. Water security and food security are inseparable, he explained. The protocols established here in Clearview County have become a national model for protecting critical resources without compromising agricultural productivity. The most significant testament to this transformation came from Janet Miller, daughter of James Miller, whose farm had been at the center of the original dispute. After the suspended auction, the Miller family had established an innovative arrangement, creating a land trust that maintained agricultural operations while permanently protecting the watershed functions that served the broader community. My father always understood that the springs on our property belonged to everyone, not just our family, Janet explained during the panel discussion. The Jenkins Protocol gave us a framework to honor that understanding while keeping the land in productive agricultural use. For Harold, the true measure of success wasn't the conference attendance or the academic papers analyzing the Clearview County model. It was in the tangible changes visible across the landscape. Farms that remained working agricultural operations rather than development sites, watershed protections that preserved water quality throughout the region, and a renewed respect for the generational knowledge that informed responsible land management. After the formal presentations, Harold found himself approached by farmers from neighboring counties, each with stories about how the reformed land transfer system had affected their communities. Some had been able to keep family farms in operation because of the new valuation metrics that recognized ecological services. Others had established easements that compensated them for watershed protection while maintaining agricultural productivity. Never thought I'd see the day when knowing how water moves across your land would be worth more than what you could build on it, one farmer commented, shaking Harold's hand. The lands always valued that knowledge, Harold replied simply. We just needed the market to catch up. 20 years after Harold Jenkins was escorted from the Agrimax auction, Clearview County had become a case study in agricultural transformation. The confrontation that began with an elderly farmer standing up for a watershed covenant had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond water protection regulations. The Clearview County Agricultural Heritage Center, established on what had been the eastern portion of the Miller farm, stood as the physical embodiment of this transformation. The center, housed in the renovated Miller family barn, combined educational facilities, research space, and demonstration plots showcasing sustainable agricultural practices that honored both economic viability and environmental stewardship. Harold Jenkins, now 92, moved carefully with the aid of a walking stick as he made his way through the center for its 20th anniversary celebration. Though age had slowed his movements and whitened what remained of his hair, his mind remained sharp, his blue eyes still observant beneath bushy white eyebrows. "Grandpa, they're ready for you in the main hall," said Melissa Jenkins, his granddaughter, and now the executive director of the Heritage Center. At 38, she embodied the next generation's approach to agriculture, formally trained in agricultural economics at the State University, but equally versed in the traditional knowledge passed down through her family. The main hall of the Heritage Center was filled beyond capacity for the anniversary event. Local farmers sat alongside corporate executives, university researchers, and government officials. Distinctions that had once represented adversarial relationships now blurred by 2 decades of collaborative stewardship. Brigadier General Samuel Jenkins, now retired at 65, stepped to the podium to open the ceremony. His military bearing remained evident, though his uniform had been replaced by business casual attire appropriate for his current role as a consultant on national water security infrastructure. 20 years ago, he began, my father stood in an auction house not far from here, attempting to share vital information about a watershed covenant. When he was dismissed and escorted out, none of us could have imagined how that moment would transform not just Clearview County but agricultural land management across the region. The audience included many who had witnessed that transformation firsthand. Farmers who had adopted new stewardship practices, corporate representatives who had reformed business models, and community members who had benefited from protected watersheds and preserved agricultural heritage. Among the honored guests seated in the front row was Victor Blackwell, now in his mid-70s. The former auctioneer had retired from Agrimax a decade earlier, but not before establishing the company's Integrated Agricultural Assessment Division as an industry leader in responsible land transfers. His personal journey from dismissing Harold Jenkins to becoming an advocate for agricultural stewardship represented the broader institutional transformations that had occurred. The Jenkins Protocol, Samuel continued, began as a simple principle that land has value beyond its sale price and that generational knowledge deserves respect alongside technical expertise. Today, that principle informs agricultural policy throughout the region and has been adopted by federal agencies as a model for sustainable land management. When Harold was helped to the podium, a standing ovation greeted him. He acknowledged it with characteristic modesty, uncomfortable with accolades, but determined to use the occasion to reinforce the principles he had championed. I never intended to start a movement, he began, his voice softer than in years past, but still carrying natural authority. I just wanted them to acknowledge that water follows its own rules, not the ones we write on property deeds. He gestured toward the large windows that framed a view of the protected watershed, the springs that had been at the center of the original covenant, now flowing through carefully maintained wetlands that served both wildlife habitat and water filtration functions. What we've accomplished these past 20 years isn't about regulation or restriction, Harold continued. It's about recognition, understanding that land isn't just a commodity to be bought and sold, but a living system that sustains communities across generations. The sustainable land management practices pioneered in Clearview County had spread throughout the region, creating an agricultural landscape that balanced productivity with protection. Family farms remained viable economic operations rather than targets for corporate acquisition. Water quality had improved measurably across the watershed. Most significantly, the relationship between farmers, corporate interests, and regulatory agencies had evolved from antagonism to collaboration. As Harold concluded his remarks, he offered a simple observation that captured the essence of the transformation. The land remembers how we treat it, and now we remember to listen to what the land has been telling us all along. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.